This is Nigeria, the most populous black nation in the world. This is Nigeria, where paradise drowns in greed. This is Nigeria, where the world's richest soil meets its darkest history in the hands of a royal Dutch company and their quest for black gold. Hi there, it's Sisters, and I'll be unearthing the history behind Shell's activities in Nigeria over the past years, and the real reason it has decided to stop its business of active oil exploration in the country. So here's the thing. The time is November 1938, and Shell has just been granted an exploration license to prospect for oil in Nigeria by the colonial government under the name Shell Darcy. This royal Dutch group, popularly known as Shell, is a fusion of over 1,700 companies all over the world. And this group is owned by two companies, the Royal Dutch Group of the Netherlands and the Shell Transport and Trading Group of the Great Britain. Shell Nigeria, which is a member of this Shell Corporation, was one of the largest producers in the Royal Dutch Group. It explored and collected over 80% of its oil from the Niger Delta region in Nigeria. But before the discovery of oil, Nigeria relied heavily on its agricultural exports for survival. However, as a country that was beaming with a lot of prospects from many untapped natural resources, coupled with a corrupt government and military, this company came right in time to exploit the entire nation. Gold is struck, black gold. Shell Darcy discovered the Oloibiri oil field on Sunday, 15th of January 1956. This was after almost 50 years of futile oil exploration by several other international oil companies. At this point, Nigeria is about to find itself in an exclusive league of countries known as petrostates. So what's a petrostate? This word comes from combining petroleum and state. So basically, a petrostate is a country whose economy is heavily dependent on oil or natural gas extraction and exports. Essentially, it's a state that is dependent on its petrol wealth. Some countries on this list include Saudi Arabia, Russia, Venezuela, Angola, and Azerbaijan. So it's both a blessing and a curse. Discovery of oil and the elevation of Nigeria into a petrostate came with its ills. It's like a two-edged sword, both a blessing and a curse. And I should mention that petrostates have a lot in common. While I was carrying out my research, I found a good word for this, and it is known as a resource curse. A resource curse is an economic phenomenon that suggests that the abundance of a natural resource will hamper economic development. While this is not true in every case, there are some challenges that are common to petrostates. First of this is concentrated power. Power and wealth are often concentrated in the hands of a small elite, and this includes government officials and energy companies. Also, the struggle with weak diversification. More often than not, other sectors of the economy in these countries tend to be underdeveloped or outrightly neglected. Venezuela is a good example of this. Its reliance on oil has strangled the country's economic growth in other areas. Also, there is a high dependence on oil and gas. This is because oil and gas revenue represents a large portion of this country's GDP and the government's budget. In a release by the EITI, which is the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, in 2023, oil and gas accounts for 65% of the federal government of Nigeria's revenue and over 85% of Nigeria's total exports. This is not as good as it looks on paper, as the heavy reliance on oil can plunge the country into a state of total economic collapse in the event of a reduction in demand or a change in global oil prices. Also, the struggle with political instability. Petrostates can be susceptible to political turmoils due to corruption, resource conflict, and dependence on volatile oil prices. Finally, there are environmental concerns.
Our people cannot sleep without having soot as a thing to worry.
It's terrible. It's actually terrible.
Oil and gas extraction and export have significant environmental impacts, including pollution, oil spills, and climate change. The influence of Shell in Nigeria came with many concerns. After the discovery of the Oloibiri oil field, things didn't take so long before turning sour, as their real intentions began to surface. The Oloibiri oil field was an onshore oil field named after Oloibiri, a small creek community of Obia local government area of Bayelsa State, Nigeria. It forms part of the communities in the Niger Delta region. By April of the year 1956, Shell Darcy had changed its name to Shell Petroleum Development Company of Nigeria Limited. For simplicity, we can simply call it the SPDC. And within 2 years, it expanded its activities, producing almost 5,000 barrels of oil in a single day on the golden oil fields of Oloibiri. But what was Shell's promise to Nigeria and the people of the Niger Delta? Before being granted concession to explore and extract oil in Nigeria, the SPDC made some tongue-in-cheek promises. For example, they promised economic development. Shell promised to invest in Nigeria's economy and contribute to its growth. This includes creating jobs, developing infrastructure, and supporting local businesses. Also, they promised environmental protection. Due to the volatility and ecocidal tendencies of their work, Shell promised to operate responsibly and minimize its environmental impact. This includes reducing pollution, protecting biodiversity, and restoring damaged ecosystems. Also, Shell promised to take on social responsibility to support social development in Nigeria, including education, healthcare, and community development projects. Finally, Shell promised transparency and accountability. The promise was to be transparent about its operation and accountable to the Nigerian government and people. This includes regular reporting on its activities and financial performance, and engaging with stakeholders to address concerns, particularly from host communities. But did Shell fulfill its promises? We'll leave this question for later. After about 20 years of milking this small creek dry, active oil exploration and production was eventually discontinued. Oloibiri oil reserves began depleting by the 1970s, leading to a gradual decline in production activity. The official end of oil production in Oloibiri is generally considered to be in the year 1978. So, the gold rush was over, but the people of Oloibiri were left wallowing in poverty, worse off than Shell methods. The once blooming agricultural lands and aquatic bodies of Oloibiri became morbid wastelands, filled with abandoned fishing ports, spoiled by environmental pollution from massive oil spills. As expected, the resource costs fought them badly, as many locals were lured from traditional agriculture and fishing into the gold rush for oil money. Sadly, however, the wells dried up, and so did their sources of livelihood. After leaving Oloibiri, the SPDC moved to Ogoni land. Oil was discovered in Ogoni land in 1958, and what this meant was more money for the organization as well as the government. Now, you should have realized that I've not talked about the government so far, but at this point it's important that I mention that the government was also a player, and perhaps a silent player at this point. It got tax and royalties on the oil produced, and this strengthened the irregularities and atrocities that were committed by this company. Like a palm iced, successive colonial, military, and democratic governments acted in concert to allow the actions of these companies go unchecked. It was a perfect fusion of corruption and greed. So Shell, in its usual manner, brought the same promise to the locals in Ogoni land. It was a promise of a brighter future in exchange for their land and seabeds flowing with liquid gold. Since the discovery of the oil fields in this region, the SPDC has drilled over 100 wells in the Ogoni region, while plaguing their lands with severe irreparable environmental degradation. Locals were languishing in poverty, their waters black with crude, and their air filled with soot. It was an environmental bullying and molestation of the sort. But the Ogonis were not to be deadbeats or walkovers. Shell's relationship with the Ogoni people in the Niger Delta of Nigeria became controversial, and accusations of various human rights abuses and environmental damage soon began to surface. The rapacious damage done by consistent pipeline leaks and gas flaring could no longer be hidden. Their lands had become black oil swamps, and their aquatic water bodies became burial homes for fishes. Record assets that although Shell drills oil in 28 countries, a whopping 40% of its oil spills worldwide has occurred in the Niger Delta. It was massive. The Niger Delta was fast becoming one of the most polluted places on the planet. Poisoned air, poisoned water meant that they were living in a perpetual state of struggle against the forces they fed, yet without their interest at heart. Many of these locals came down with respiratory illnesses, cancers, and an unfathomable degree of poverty, lack, and want. But where did it all begin for the Ogonis? The problem of the Ogonis has its roots in the colonial era. The British colonial rule handed down to us a wide and weird combination of multiple ethnic groups, lumped into regions. The country was divided into the Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba extractions, without considering several ethnic minorities, and this was the case with the Ogonis. They were an ethnic minority with a population of just about 500,000 inhabitants. The Ogonis had their land, their wealth, and resources in the hands of unelected officials from ethnic majorities. And as it was for the Ogonis, so it was for several other communities in the Niger Delta, like in Oloibiri. They were plagued with the activities of explorers in search of liquid gold, but they lacked constitutional power and protection by successive ruling governments, which meant that they had no other option than to speak up, to fight, and to win. As early as 1990, voices among the Ogonis began thundering out in pain. Having watched their rivers choke on oil and gas flares repaint their beautiful skies, there was no hope in sight. Their voices were all they had, and then came Ken Saro-Wiwa. Ken Saro-Wiwa was a poet and an environmental activist of the Ogoni descent. Ken Saro-Wiwa, together with the Ogoni chiefs, formed a non-violent action group called the Movement for the Survival of the Ogoni People, MOSOP. This organization was a peaceful campaign for environmental sanity across the Niger Delta. Through MOSOP, they penned the Ogoni Bill of Rights. It was a peaceful demand for political control of Ogoni affairs by Ogoni people, for control and use of Ogoni economic resources for Ogoni development, for adequate and direct representation as a right for the Ogoni people in all Nigerian national institutions, and the right to protect the Ogoni environment and ecology from further degradation. Important details on the marginalization and neglect of the Ogoni people were all contained in this Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights was addressed to the Nigerian government as well as several international communities. It didn't take long before physical protests started to rock the entire Niger Delta. In one of these peaceful protests, Shell was accused of requesting the presence of the mobile police force to stem the tide, and this resulted in mass destruction and death of over 80 people and 500 properties. MOSOP soon became the strongest opposition to Shell in the Niger Delta. The force was growing and the people were not going to back down. On numerous occasions, several non-violent protests were staged which saw Shell involve the government in a serious breach of human rights. As it would seem, Shell was well aware that it could, together with the government, evade accountability rather than fix existing issues. The result of this was arrests and loss of lives and properties. As recorded by Amnesty International in its article, Shell, a criminal enterprise. After General Sani Abacha seized power in November 1993, Shell wrote almost immediately to the newly appointed military administrator of Rivers State, saying that community disturbances, blockade, and sabotage has led to a major drop in production and asked for help to minimize the disruptions. The company made a practice of involving the military and the police, as well as providing financial assistance when needed to allow them to continue work in Ogoni land. Raids, killing and torture became the norm. So while all of this was going on back home, Ken Saro-Wiwa remained at the forefront of the confrontation between the indigenous communities of the Niger Delta, the oil companies and the government. He started to become the face of the struggle. He had fame and international stature, and the protests were beginning to receive international media attention. But like every movement, there were internal issues and debatable extremes. There were inter-ethnic clashes with neighboring tribes, ideological wars on methods by MOSOP, and schisms based on these differences. This eventually led to the murder of 4 Ogoni chiefs, and Ken Saro-Wiwa was detained in connection to these incidents. To make matters worse, the then military administrator of Rivers State, Lieutenant Colonel Dauda Komu, wasted no time blaming the killings on MOSOP and carrying out repressive activities in the name of fishing out the killers. This eventually led to the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni 9. Here's the gist. Following the murder of the 4 Ogoni chiefs, one of the most brazen displays of human rights abuses occurred. Ken Saro-Wiwa, alongside 9 other activists, were sentenced to death for the murder of these chiefs in a trial by a special military tribunal whose decision could not be appealed. The interesting part of this trial is that none of these men were in Ogoni land when the murders occurred. I would say that Shell remains complicit in the entire process that led to the execution of Ken Saro-Wiwa and the Ogoni 9, because he just kept seeking government intervention throughout the whole process. Here were Ken Saro-Wiwa's final words before the military-appointed tribunal. I repeat that we all stand before history. I and my colleagues are not the only ones of trial. Shell is here on trial, and it is as well that it is represented by counsel said to be holding a watching brief. The company has indeed ducked this particular trial, but its day will surely come, and the lessons learned here will prove useful to it, for there is no doubt in my mind that the ecological war that the company has waged in the Delta will be called to question sooner than later, and the crimes of that war will be duly punished. The crime of the company's dirty wars against the Ogoni people will also be punished. 2 days after the activist Ken Saro-Wiwa was executed, the Commonwealth Ministerial Action Group, CMAG, suspended Nigeria from the Commonwealth.
I said yesterday that I thought this was a fraudulent trial, a bad verdict, an unjust sentence, and it has now been followed by judicial murder. I don't think that is acceptable. I see no way in which it can be defended. And if the Harare principles mean anything, I do not myself see how Nigeria can stay in the Commonwealth until they return to democratic government.
In practical terms, what the suspension means is that Nigeria was excluded from receiving any new Commonwealth technical assistance, such as agricultural training, which took place in 1993. And also it prevented Nigerian government representatives from participating in intergovernmental Commonwealth meetings and events. This suspension was to be a public declaration from the Commonwealth to the Nigerian government and the international community condemning the undemocratic and human rights abuses which reverberated all across the world.
In our power as friends and as brothers to assist, but apparently they are inexorably set on a course of self-destruction.
Actually, this didn't do much. The sanctions did not prevent further human rights suppression and abuses. MOSOP will later reveal that 20 others were arrested alongside Ken Saro-Wiwa and the 9. These 20 were not released until September 7, 1998, under the leadership of General Abubakar, after the death of General Sani Abacha, and this was on bail. The international community kept the pressure on before this decision was even made. When you examine the details and the reason for their imprisonment, you find out that it was almost the same unsubstantiated charges that were used to execute Ken Saro-Wiwa and the 9. These men testified to have been under unsanitary conditions, and they shared their cells with insects, rats, and snakes. Water was a luxury, as their only source of water was well used to dump dead inmates. Sadly, another 25 people were arrested in January 1998 for organizing the annual peaceful Ogoni Day celebration. There were several other Ogonis imprisoned because they appeared to support the Ogoni cause, or to help others remember Ken Saro-Wiwa, whose details we almost no longer have with us. At this point, I guess I should say, long story short. Just let's fast forward to 2024. Where are we now? If you have been following the story, it's obvious that Shell has faced fierce battles in the Niger Delta region, mostly due to the atrocities it committed together with the government. Now, I have also chosen to say little about the vandalism and theft that these foreign investors have been facing in the Nigerian oil sector, but I should mention that it exists, even until now. So I am of the opinion that the individuals that carry out these thefts are not the common man, because the machinery and the infrastructure needed to carry out these thefts are not something the common man in Oloibiri or Ogoni can afford. So it almost seems like the theft is organized and carried out by frustrated individuals sponsored by higher powers to act as saboteurs or for cheap pecuniary gain. From another angle, it's a question of cause and effect. So there is a resource cost in place, a corrupt government, thieving corporations with no disregard for the people and their lands, coupled with a disgruntled people, will produce nothing less than the ecocide and the crisis and chaos that has engulfed the Niger Delta region for almost a century. Now, if we are to spotlight the issue of spills, Shell reported that from 2001, it lost about 110,535 barrels of oil along the network of pipelines and wells that it operates. So while oil spills have occurred over the whole network of Shell's oil wells and pipelines, analysis of spill location shows that time after time, the same stretches of pipelines are affected by this oil theft and sabotage. So regardless of the cost, companies are still required by the Nigerian law and in line with the international industry standards to take all responsible measures to prevent them. But the high number of spills that seem to reoccur at certain hotspots over many years demonstrates that there is a major failure by these companies. They do not put in place all reasonable precautions to prevent them. It's more like, since you know the problem is likely to occur, seek all necessary help to mitigate it. But Shell did nothing of this. Now, what you would expect is that these companies were to simply identify the hotspots and take appropriate measures to protect them, such as setting up surveillance patrols and buffing up the securities in those areas. So one would expect working together with locals and the government to ensure that the problems are fixed once and for all. But Shell failed in this aspect, and I think all of these turmoils contributed to the decision to finally divest in Nigeria. Let me explain it this way. What Shell has done is simple. So they're stopping active onshore oil exploration and they are focusing on offshore and deep water operations. So they have not totally left as we are made to believe. What they have simply done is to sell off their assets to a consortium of 5 companies, 1 foreign and 4 Nigerian owned. The 4 are owned and managed by former Shell managers. So this new consortium, which is known as the Renaissance Africa Energy Company Limited, is made up of Cindy Western, Aradel Energy, First E&P, Walter Smith, and Petrolate. The entire acquisition totals up to 2.4 billion, and 1.3 billion out of this is to be paid immediately for the use of Shell's oil blocks, while the remaining 1.1 billion, which is for Shell's pipelines, offices, and the Focados terminal, will be at a later date. The official statement reads, Shell has reached an agreement to sell its Nigerian Onshore subsidiary, the Shell Petroleum Development Company of Nigeria Limited, to Renaissance, a consortium of 5 companies comprising 4 exploration and production companies based in Nigeria, and an international energy group. Completion of this transaction is subject to approvals by the federal government of Nigeria and other conditions. Transaction will preserve SPDC's operating capabilities for the benefit of joint venture. Actually, in some way, it looks good on the surface. It's more like good readers to bad rubbish. and a win for the people of Ogoni land and the Oloibiri community. A win for those that have been held ransom and have suffered as a result of the activities of these companies. But when you think of it again, it's more of Shell being smart by how Shell has successfully extracted itself from the problems and the challenges it has faced from operating in the Niger Delta. As I said, they have not had it easy with the local communities. There has been incessant oil spills, environmental damage by their actions, and accusations of several human rights violations as well as others. So with all of these pending lawsuits, walking away from it may seem like a more calculated move than we think. The Shell chapter in Nigeria is almost as good as gone. But you see, here are some things the government can do moving on from here. So I found this organization called Nostra, which is more of responsible for oil spill detection and response. And I believe the government should find ways to strengthen its capacity and increase their budget, so as to ensure their operations are more calculated and on time. Also, the government should require operators to publish all documents and reports that relates to spill site cleanups, because oftentimes there are spills where you see these operators simply neglect them and shy away from dealing with them. When there are aged and damaged pipelines, the companies should take every necessary action to decommission them. And then a yearly submission of the condition of their pipeline and other assets should be put in place. So this can help disclose the age of their infrastructures and whether there are needs for repairs or replacements. The government should also find ways to monitor the health of affected communities, improve their healthcare facilities, and carry out an in-depth check of their drinking water and food sources to be sure they are not contaminated by hydrocarbons. Also, more people-driven projects should be done in the host communities and the Niger Delta region in particular. Education and healthcare should be more accessible, and jobs should be created for the working population in all of these communities. Many of the demands of the Ogoni people are still left unattended to. Rather than spend protracted time in court, Shell should start to own up to its atrocities. It should find out ways to carry out proper reparation and compensation of the families and relatives of those affected by the struggle over the years. There should be a committal to funding the total cleanup of the entire Niger Delta from start to completion. Timelines need to be set and not just mere promises made. Finally, the government of Nigeria needs to start taking other sectors seriously, as the future of oil-based exploitation and dependence by countries is beginning to look bleak. You see, Shell is partly gone, but I think the problem remains. These new companies might not do things differently, and the problem might just keep rocking the Niger Delta for many, many years to come. Will these new players do things differently, or are they simply new chips off the old block? Let me hear your thoughts in the comment section, and don't forget to click the buttons to like, to share, and to subscribe. Catch you again soon.